I never liked camping alone, but there are certain ideas that come to you in late hours of boredom when you want to prove to yourself that you're braver than you really are. The forest had always been a place of calm for me during the day. The smell of pine drifting through the wind, the crunch of dried leaves beneath boots, the way light filters down in fragmented patterns through 1,000 crooked branches. But night in the forest is something entirely different. The darkness is absolute, swallowing the air, the path, the sky above. That evening, after setting up my small two-person tent, I sat by the fire until the flames turned to little more than glowing embers. The woods around me seemed quiet, but not in a peaceful way, more like a tense silence, the kind you only notice when it lingers too long. It was as though every living thing nearby was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen. I crawled into the tent, zipped the flap closed, and tried to convince myself that sleep would come quickly. The nylon walls around me were thin, so thin that the fabric carried the scent of damp earth and faint smoke from the fire outside. I laid down on my sleeping bag, feeling the uneven hardness of rocks beneath the ground tarp, listening to the wind thread through the branches. At some point, I must have drifted into a shallow sleep, but I woke suddenly, not with a start, but with the uneasy sensation that something was moving outside. The air inside the tent felt warmer than before, close and suffocating, and every sound seemed magnified against the silence. That was when I heard it. A step. Just one. Slow. Measured. The sound of weight pressing down into soil, the faint snap of a twig underfoot. I held my breath, waiting for it to repeat, hoping it was just the forest settling into the night. Then it came again, this time to my left. Closer. The rhythm was careful, deliberate. Someone or something was circling the tent. My body stiffened in the sleeping bag, every muscle tightening in instinctive fear. The sound continued, soft but distinct. Step, then another. Each footfall pressed into the dirt with calculated precision, as though whoever walked outside wanted me to hear, but not to know their intent. The circle was slow. It moved from one side of the tent to the other, never hurried, never stopping completely. I stared at the thin fabric inches from my face, imagining what shape might be on the other side. The nylon trembled faintly with each breath I exhaled. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. The footsteps never ceased. They dragged around the perimeter, pausing just long enough to suggest someone had stopped to lean in, listening. I imagined a shadow standing inches away, separated only by the fragile sheet of material. My mind painted its presence in unbearable detail. A figure crouched low, peering through the fabric that couldn't hide me, watching the rise and fall of my chest as I lay frozen. I tried to calm my thoughts, to force myself into rational explanations. An animal, perhaps. A deer grazing, moving in cautious half-circles. But the weight was wrong. Too steady. Too slow. There was no rustle of leaves, no rooting in the undergrowth. Just footsteps, deliberate and patient. The air in the tent grew heavier. I could smell my own sweat gathering at the collar of my shirt, soaking into the sleeping bag. My heartbeat was too loud, thudding in my ears, and I was terrified the sound would betray me. The footsteps circled endlessly. Sometimes they quickened, as though whoever paced outside grew impatient. Other times they slowed to an unbearable crawl, the silence between each step stretching until I wondered if it had finally gone, until the next sound pressed into the earth again. I thought about unzipping the flap, shining my flashlight into the night, but the thought was unbearable. Light would reveal me, paint me in the open like prey. No matter how thin the nylon walls were, at least they gave me a barrier, a fragile illusion of safety. Hours dragged on in a distorted rhythm. I would close my eyes, trying to pretend I could slip back into sleep, only for the crunch of dirt outside to jolt me back into a state of raw awareness. At times, the steps came so close that I could hear faint breathing, or maybe I only imagined it. An exhale against the tent's fabric, moist and soft, as though the night itself leaned in. The fire outside had long died, leaving nothing but cold ashes. The forest around was void of sound. No crickets, no distant owls, no wind through the branches. Only the footsteps, circling and circling, the rhythm unbroken through the black hours of the night. I thought of unzipping the tent and running into the woods, but the thought was worse. Out there, I would be completely exposed. Out there, I wouldn't even know from which direction it approached. At least here, I knew it circled me. I could track its position by sound, even if I couldn't bear to look. My body ached from holding so still, every joint locked tight. My eyes burned from staring at the ceiling of the tent. And still, the pacing never ended. At one point, I can't recall how late, it stopped. The footsteps ceased in mid-motion, as though frozen in place. The silence was unbearable. Seconds dragged on, then minutes. I strained my ears, desperate for the sound to resume, even though it terrified me. Then I realized the shape of a shadow lingered on the other side of the fabric. Tall, distorted, blocking the faintest spill of moonlight against the tent wall. It didn't move, didn't step, just stood, inches from where I lay. My chest tightened. I shut my eyes and forced myself not to breathe too loudly. The shadow didn't shift. It waited. I don't know for how long. Time dissolved into something meaningless. Eventually, the steps began again, slow at first, then steady, picking up the same endless circling as before. Around and around. When dawn finally came, the pale gray light crept across the nylon walls of the tent like salvation. The footsteps had stopped sometime just before. I hadn't dared to move until sunlight pushed through fully. With shaking hands, I unzipped the flap. Cold morning air rushed in, damp with dew, and the forest looked innocent again, green and alive with the chirping of birds that hadn't sung a single note through the night. I stepped out, my legs weak, my body sore from hours of tension. That was when I saw the ground. Around my tent, clear as if carved into the soil, was a perfect circle of footprints. The earth was pressed down in a ring, the path looping over itself again and again, countless times. The prints were unmistakable, bare feet, long human, and they never trailed off into the woods. They began at the edge of the circle, and ended there too. I've spent much of my life in the woods, hunting, tracking, or just wandering where most people never bother to go. Out there, far from highways and towns, there's a kind of silence that presses against you, a silence so thick that even the smallest sound, wind through dry leaves, a branch giving under its own weight, feels alive. I've grown comfortable in that quiet, maybe even dependent on it. But there are nights I wish I never stepped past the treeline. Nights where the silence isn't empty at all. Nights where it feels like something is watching, pacing, waiting. This is one of those nights. It was late autumn when I decided to hike deep into the state forest. The air was sharp and cold, carrying that faint metallic tang that comes before snow. The sky had gone gray early, the sun smothered by clouds that stretched like dirty wool across the horizon. I carried my rifle, my pack, and enough supplies for 3 days. It was meant to be a solo hunt, just me in the woods. By dusk, I had found a clearing that felt right. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the trees around me stood tall and thick enough to break most of the wind. I set up camp methodically, laying down my tarp, my small tent, and then circling stones for a fire pit. I gathered dry branches, broke them by hand, and lit a fire that cracked and hissed as it took to life. The warmth of the flames was a comfort as the forest grew dark around me. The shadows between trees lengthened until they seemed endless. The smell of smoke and pine was heavy, and above me, the clouds began to scatter, opening the sky to a thin slice of moonlight. It was as I leaned back against my pack, staring into the flames, that I noticed something I shouldn't have. Another glow. Not close, at least not within the clearing, but there, through the tree trunks, I caught a flicker of orange light. A steady pulsing, just high enough to be a fire. My stomach tightened as I realized it wasn't the reflection of my own campfire. It was separate, a second fire, and it was already burning. There shouldn't have been anyone else this deep in. The trails leading here were narrow and overgrown, the kind most casual hikers wouldn't dare to push through. Hunters usually stick to the ridges or near water. This spot was in the middle of nowhere. Yet, the glow was unmistakable. Another campfire. I sat there for what felt like an hour, staring through the trees. I kept expecting to see movement around it, shadows of someone tending the flames, maybe cooking, maybe sitting. But the fire burned with no figure near it. No sound of voices, no crunch of footsteps, no rustle of clothing. Just the faint flicker of orange far off in the dark. I should have ignored it. I should have stayed where I was, kept my distance. But curiosity has a way of gnawing through better judgment, especially in the woods where your mind twists silence into questions. Eventually, I got to my feet. The cold air rushed in as I stepped away from my own fire, my boots crunching softly on pine needles. I didn't grab my rifle at first, but halfway toward the tree-line, instinct told me to sling it over my shoulder. Something about walking into the dark without it felt wrong. The forest swallowed me almost immediately. The warmth of my camp faded, the fire's light shrinking behind me until it was nothing but a dull ember through the trees. Ahead, the other glow pulsed, faint but steady, like it was breathing. Each step was deliberate. The ground was uneven, littered with roots that seemed to snake just high enough to catch my boots. The smell of smoke grew stronger, mixing with the damp rot of leaves. My ears strained for sound, but the forest held its breath. Even the usual nocturnal chorus, owls, crickets, the far-off yip of coyotes, was gone. I reached the clearing where the fire burned. It was small, just a ring of stones with logs laid in a careful pyramid. The flames licked upward, alive and strong, sparks snapping into the night. Heat radiated from it, undeniable, real. But the camp around it was wrong. There was no tent, no pack, no tools, not even footprints in the dirt leading up to the fire. Just the fire itself, blazing in the middle of an empty clearing, as if someone had built it and vanished the moment it caught. I stood there at the tree-line, my breath fogging in the cold. The flames shifted and spat as though they were aware of me. I remember an unnatural thought creeping in, that the fire didn't need anyone to tend it, that it wanted to burn, and it wanted me to see it. The longer I stood there, the colder I felt, even with the heat. My skin prickled. The back of my neck tightened. Something about the fire was wrong in a way I couldn't name. I crouched and looked closer, scanning for signs of life. A scrap of cloth, a piece of gear, anything. Nothing. The logs themselves looked dry and untouched, as though they'd been split minutes ago. The flames rose evenly, without smoke, without struggle. That was when I heard it. A snap, deep in the forest behind me. I froze. The sound wasn't close, but it was heavy enough to be a boot on a branch, not a deer stepping light. It echoed through the stillness. Then another. A slow, deliberate tread in the distance, circling. I stayed crouched at the tree-line, my rifle clutched tight, my eyes locked on the empty clearing and its impossible fire. I wanted to turn, to scan the trees, but some instinct told me not to. Whatever it was moving. Watching. The fire flared, spitting sparks. For an instant, the flames bent in one direction, as if wind had pushed them, except the night was utterly still. I couldn't stay. I backed away, one step at a time, keeping my eyes on the fire until the trees swallowed its glow. Only when I saw the faint flicker of my own camp ahead did I finally turn, my chest heaving, my breath sharp in the freezing air. But when I stepped into my clearing, my blood turned to ice. My campfire had gone out. It hadn't just dimmed or died naturally. It was gone. The stones were scattered, the wood cold, as if it had never been lit at all. My pack sat where I'd left it, my tent still standing, but the comfort of my campfire, its warmth, its light, had been erased in the short time I'd been gone. The silence was unbearable. The trees loomed black and endless, the air colder now than before. I sat by the cold ashes, rifle across my lap, and tried to steady my breathing. But out there, somewhere in the dark, I saw it again. A glow. The second campfire. Closer this time, and still no one tending it. I never liked how thin the walls of a tent felt when you were miles away from anyone else. Canvas stretched tight across flimsy poles, a thin zipper between you and everything outside. Wild animals, the shifting night, or worse, something you couldn't explain. I'd been backpacking for years, chasing solitude through mountains and valleys, and yet that thought always crept back in when I zipped myself inside, trying to pretend that thin layer of fabric was protection. That night was colder than I expected. The air had that brittle quality, like it would crack if you breathed too hard. I had pitched my tent deep inside a forest, hours away from the last trail marker. The ground smelled of damp soil and pine needles, a wet, earthy scent that clung to the inside of my nostrils. My boots were still muddy from crossing a stream earlier in the evening, and I left them outside the tent flap, trusting that no animal would drag them away in the night. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, every sound around me sharpened. The forest never goes completely silent. Branches creak overhead, owls send low calls into the dark, and small things rustle in the undergrowth. But I was used to that. What I wasn't used to was the way the stillness seemed to thicken after midnight. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. The moonlight was weak, filtered through a canopy of black branches. My tent glowed faintly, just enough to show the outline of the zipper door, and the shape of my backpack leaned in the corner. I tried to sleep, turning from side to side, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders. But something inside me was restless. My ears strained for sounds, and my heartbeat seemed to pulse too loudly in my head. It was around that hour, when time feels untethered, neither night nor morning, when I first heard it. A sound. Faint. Almost too faint. Breathing. Not mine. Not the shallow rhythm of my chest beneath the sleeping bag. This was different. Slower. Heavy. Drawn out, like someone exhaling deliberately, just on the other side of the fabric wall. At first I thought it was the wind. Sometimes a gust can slip through trees and mimic strange noises. But there was no breeze that night. The air was stagnant, cold, and unmoving. The sound came again, clearer this time. The low, wet drag of an inhale. The subtle tremor of air leaving lungs. It was close. Too close. I froze, every muscle in my body locking tight. I didn't move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. The sleeping bag suddenly felt suffocating, trapping me in its cocoon. My eyes darted to the faint curve of the tent door. The breathing was coming from that direction. Whoever, or whatever, it was stood right outside. I strained my ears. My heart hammered, so hard I thought it might give me away. The breathing was steady, slow, patient. The kind of breathing you'd hear if you stood over someone's bed, just watching. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed. Seconds stretched into minutes. The sound never faltered. It stayed at the same distance, as though whoever was outside had no intention of leaving. I thought of my boots sitting out there, of the muddy prints I might have left leading straight to my tent, of how obvious the small glow of nylon must have been in the sea of darkness. The air inside the tent felt heavy, thick with dread. I could smell the faint, sour odor of my own sweat collecting inside the fabric. I tried to listen beyond the breathing, hoping to hear footsteps, the crunch of twigs, some clue that the presence was moving away. But there was nothing, only the steady inhale and exhale. At some point, I realized it wasn't perfectly human. There was something strange about it. Each inhale came with a faint whistle, like air moving through a narrow passage. Each exhale dragged a fraction too long, fading into the night unnaturally slow. It made my skin crawl. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight into the dark. I wanted to prove to myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, curious and sniffing near my campsite. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew by the rhythm, by the weight in that sound, that something stood upright. Something was deliberately breathing against the thin sheet of fabric that separated me from the night. Minutes bled into hours. I kept my eyes open, staring at the faint outlines inside the tent. Sleep was impossible. Every now and then, I thought the breathing would stop. My chest would unclench, my muscles would loosen slightly, and then it would start again, closer this time, almost brushing the tent wall. Once, the fabric actually shifted, just a little. The faintest indentation near the zipper, like something leaned in, pressing its face close to where my head rested. I could almost feel the warmth of it through the nylon. I squeezed my eyes shut, as though that would block it out, but the sound filled my ears. Inhale, exhale, patient, waiting. The worst part was the silence in between. Those stretches where it stopped completely, long enough to convince me it had gone. I would lie there, chest aching from holding my breath, clinging to hope, and then it would come back, harsher, wetter, closer. The forest outside offered no help. No bird stirred, no branch cracked. It was as if everything else knew to stay quiet, as if the whole night had bent itself around this presence, letting it exist without interruption. I don't remember falling asleep. I think exhaustion must have pulled me under sometime near dawn, when the first pale light seeped through the canopy. But I woke with a jolt, heart still racing, ears straining for the sound. The breathing was gone. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent. The morning air rushed in, cold and damp. My boots were exactly where I left them, though the laces were wet with dew. The ground around the tent looked undisturbed, no clear prints in the soil, just the usual scatter of pine needles and leaves. And yet, I swear there was a smell, faint, lingering, like old earth turned up from a grave, a damp, sour odor that clung to the entrance flap. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was a dream, a trick of half sleep and nerves. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Dreams don't leave the air heavy with the memory of another breath. Even now, when I camp, I can't escape it. The memory of that night comes back whenever the forest grows too still. Whenever I lie awake, listening past my own breathing. Because I know what thin fabric really means. It means nothing. And if something out there decides to lean close again, nothing will keep it from me. I've always been drawn to the stillness of the woods at night. There's a silence out there that you can't find anywhere else, a kind of silence that doesn't just fill the air, but presses against you, seeping into your skin. It makes every breath louder, every heartbeat feel amplified. That's why my partner and I loved camping. We would set up deep enough that the highway's hum couldn't touch us, far enough that civilization felt like a fading memory. But I think about that night often now, and I wonder if we went too far, if we crossed some boundary that wasn't meant to be crossed. It started simple, as always. We found a clearing tucked between a cluster of tall pines. The air was sharp and damp, heavy with the earthy smell of fallen needles and decaying wood. Our tent sat snug in the soft patch of moss, its fabric glowing faintly as the last of the daylight trickled through the canopy. Everything was familiar, comfortable, even calming. We had camped dozens of times before, and nothing about that first evening suggested it would be any different. The forest settled as the sky darkened. The last birds retreated to their hidden perches, their calls replaced by the steady hum of crickets. A faint mist slithered low across the ground, weaving between the trunks like pale smoke. The fire we built was small but steady, its smoke rising in a crooked line until it dissolved into the canopy above. The warmth of the flames pushed back the chill, but just barely. The cold of the woods has a way of wrapping itself around you no matter how close you sit to the fire. By midnight, everything had gone still. The kind of stillness that feels wrong the longer it lingers. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no wind, just the faint crackling of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed the forest go quiet, but it felt heavier this time, as if something pressed down on the entire clearing. I eventually crawled into the tent, dragging the scent of smoke with me. The nylon walls glowed faintly with the embers outside, then dimmed completely as the fire collapsed into ash. Inside, the air was colder, the fabric walls barely shielding us from the damp night. My partner drifted off quickly, their breathing steady and soft. I lay awake longer, staring into the dark, letting the weight of the silence push me down until I finally surrendered to sleep. I didn't dream. At least, I don't remember dreaming. But I woke with a start, not to a sound exactly, more like the absence of one, a presence in the silence. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow, as if something unseen loomed just beyond the thin nylon barrier. The forest outside was deathly still, as though holding its breath. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, my ears straining for the slightest noise. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. When morning came, the woods felt different. The air was heavier, the light dimmer, even though the sun had risen. The mist hadn't burned away. It lingered, wrapping low around the trees like a living thing. Everything looked damp, as though it had rained overnight, though the soil beneath our feet was dry. That's when we saw them. On the trees around the clearing, symbols had been carved into the bark. Not just scratches, not random gouges from animals or storm damage. Symbols, precise, deliberate, etched deep into the trunks. Each one was different, yet they seemed connected, like fragments of some language that had no translation. Circles intersecting with jagged lines, spirals that ended in sharp angles, shapes that made no sense, but somehow felt wrong to look at. The bark around them was still fresh, raw wood pale against the dark outer layers. They hadn't been there the night before. They couldn't have been. We had sat by the fire, surrounded by these very same trees, and their surfaces had been bare. Clean, untouched. Now every tree within the clearing bore at least one mark, some carved chest high, others far above, as if whoever, or whatever, made them had reached higher than a person should be able to. The air carried a faint metallic scent. Not blood, but close. Like rust. I touched one of the carvings, pressing my fingertips against the grooves. The wood was damp, almost sticky, and colder than the surrounding bark. A shiver worked its way down my spine, and I pulled my hand back quickly, wiping it against my pants though nothing visible clung to my skin. The longer I stared at the symbols, the more wrong they felt. There was no logic to them, but they seemed to hum with meaning. as though the forest itself whispered through them in a language I wasn't supposed to understand. It wasn't just what they looked like, it was what they made me feel. A low unease coiled in my stomach, a rising pressure at the base of my skull. All day, the woods carried that weight. Even as we tried to distract ourselves, moving around camp, tending the fire, pretending it didn't matter, the symbols loomed just beyond every glance. I found myself counting them without realizing it. 12. No, 13. Then I'd turn my head, and there would be another, higher up, half hidden by mist. By afternoon, it felt as if the trees themselves had grown eyes. When night fell again, the forest sank into silence quicker than before. The firelight flickered against the carved trunks, throwing their jagged shapes into motion, shadows twisting in ways that made them seem alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been marked, us or the clearing or both. That whatever those symbols meant, they weren't meant for us to see. The silence was unbearable. Every snap of the firewood felt deafening, every rustle in the undergrowth sharp enough to pierce my chest. I found myself staring at the tent walls long after we retreated inside, tracing the faint glow of the embers as if they were the only anchor to something familiar. And then, just as sleep threatened to take me, I heard it. A sound so faint I thought it might be my imagination. A scraping, wood against wood. A slow, deliberate carve. It came from just beyond the tent, circling, moving from tree to tree. My breath caught, my entire body frozen as I listened. The noise continued, steady and patient, as though invisible hands were cutting new shapes into the bark, one after another. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a branch shifting, anything but what it truly sounded like. But I knew. Deep down I knew. Something was out there, working methodically, marking the trees in the same silence that now suffocated us. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe too loud. The sound crept closer, circling the clearing, scraping into the wood with unbearable slowness. Hours must have passed before it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. When dawn finally came, I forced myself outside. The mist was thicker than before, swallowing the clearing in a pale shroud. The air was colder, sharp enough to sting the lungs. And the trees, there were more symbols, dozens more, covering not just the trees around the clearing, but extending into the forest beyond. An endless trail of markings, each one fresh, each one damp, as though they had only just been carved. I never followed them. I never wanted to know where they led. We left the clearing that morning. We didn't pack carefully, didn't take our time. We just left. The forest felt alive as we walked, the mist clutching at our legs, the air thick with the metallic tang of those carvings. I swear I could feel the symbols at my back, watching, pressing against my skin like invisible eyes. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear that sound again. The scraping, the slow, deliberate carving in the dark. And I know, whatever made those marks wasn't finished. I don't know how to explain what happened without sounding like I've lost my mind, but it happened out there, and I can't shake it. It clings to me like the damp smell of pine needles after rain, stuck in the fibers of my memory, refusing to be washed out. I had gone hiking alone in the mountains, a stretch of wilderness I had only read about in trail guides. It wasn't reckless. I was prepared, stocked with supplies, maps, a small tent, and enough food to last days. The woods in that part of the country are thick with pine, their sharp needles carpeting the ground in dark green. Even when the wind doesn't move, you can smell the resin, that cold, almost metallic tang that fills your lungs and makes you feel far from anything human. The first day went fine, just quiet trails, the crunch of dirt under my boots, and the long shadows of trees stretching over me. By the time the sun dipped low, I had found a clearing just large enough to pitch my tent. The clearing was surrounded by pines so tall and clustered that they felt like a wall closing me in, but I didn't mind. I set up camp, lit a small fire, and sat there listening to the occasional distant snap of branches echoing from the forest. Normal stuff. The sounds of an alive forest settling into night. It wasn't until the fire died down, and I crawled into the tent, that I noticed something strange. A stillness, an unnatural kind of silence. Usually, the woods at night come alive, crickets, wind, the scuttle of small animals. But as I lay there, I realized it was completely silent. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until you swear you can hear your own pulse. Sleep didn't come easy. My body was exhausted, but my mind was restless, scanning every non-existent sound, focusing on the muted air outside the thin nylon walls of the tent. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep until, sometime deep in the night, something pulled me fully awake. I don't know why. There was no sound, no movement, but something inside me stirred with unease. I unzipped the flap and poked my head out, expecting nothing but the dark shapes of the trees. But that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of moonlight on bark, a pale shape standing among the rows of pines at the far edge of the clearing. I blinked hard, rubbed at my eyes, but it didn't go away. It was too tall, too straight, too still. A figure. It stood between two massive trunks, perfectly framed, as if it wanted to be seen. It wasn't moving, not swaying like the trees, not shifting like an animal. Just standing. My first thought was that it was another person, maybe a lost hiker, maybe someone camping nearby. But the longer I stared, the less it looked human. Its form was thin, unnaturally thin, and the skin, or what I thought was skin, seemed pale enough to reflect the faintest light. I couldn't make out details of a face, only the stark whiteness of it against the black backdrop of the forest. I froze there, half in my tent, my breath clouding in the cool air. I don't know how long I stayed like that, just staring back at it. Minutes stretched like hours. The figure never moved. Not a twitch, not a step forward, not even a tilt of the head. Just there, watching. I pulled myself back inside the tent, zipped it shut, and sat up rigid, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were damp with sweat. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave, but the darkness beyond the tent felt endless. Where would I run? Which way would I go? The idea of stepping into that silent forest with that thing somewhere out there was worse than staying put. So I waited. Every so often, I would unzip the tent just a little, barely enough to peek out. Each time, the figure was still there, always in the exact same spot, between the same two trees, waiting. The night dragged on like that, endless and suffocating. The pale figure never moved closer, never drifted away. It just remained. I stopped checking after a while, because I already knew what I'd see. Its presence was carved into my brain like a scar. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the moonlight and the pines were playing tricks on my eyes. But when I finally dared another look, the position of the moon had shifted higher, shadows moved, but the figure was still there, untouched by the change of light. What struck me most was how quiet everything stayed. Not once did a breeze stir the branches above me. Not once did a night insect break the silence. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, watching alongside me. The hours stretched unbearably. I sat inside my tent, my legs aching from staying frozen in one position, my throat dry from shallow breathing. Sleep was impossible. My body trembled with fatigue and fear. I thought about turning on my flashlight, shining it toward the trees, but some deep, primal part of me stopped my hand each time. Because if that light revealed more detail, if it showed me what exactly stood there, I don't think I could have handled it. Then, at some point, the black sky softened into a bruised purple. Dawn was coming. I felt the air lighten, the promise of day just beyond the horizon. For the first time all night, I let myself believe I might be safe. When the first thin beams of sunlight pushed between the trees, I unzipped the tent again. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I forced myself to look. The forest had begun to reveal its colors again, greens, browns, golds. The figure was still there, but now in the daylight, it was even more unsettling. I could see it more clearly, though not enough for detail. Its skin looked impossibly pale, like something that had never felt the sun. Its body was lanky, too tall for a human, the limbs slightly too long, like it had been stretched. And it still hadn't moved. Not once, all night long. I sat there watching as the sun climbed higher. The light filled the clearing, touched the treetops, painted the world in warmth. But even then, the figure stayed cold, untouched by morning. And then, just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, I blinked, and it was gone. No movement, no sound, no retreating steps into the forest. Just gone, as though it had never been there at all. I didn't wait. I packed my things in shaking hands, shoved everything into my bag without care for order, and left the clearing. I didn't eat, didn't rest, just walked as fast as my legs could carry me until I was out of those woods. I don't remember the trail back, only the thundering of my heart, the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders, and the constant paranoia that if I turned around, I'd see it again, standing among the pines. I never went back to those mountains. I never camped alone again. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I see it. That pale figure between the trees, waiting, always waiting. And I wonder how many other nights it has stood in silence, watching, unnoticed, until the sunrise. I remember that night as if it's still happening somewhere just beyond the trees, still playing out in the darkness where no one can interfere. It was one of those camping trips that began harmlessly, with laughter, the smell of smoke on our clothes, and the quiet thrill of being so far from towns and traffic. We were deep in the woods, the kind of place where the silence isn't just an absence of sound. It's heavy, alive, pressing against your ears. We had strung our food bags high, as hikers are supposed to do. Not because we were worried about bears exactly, though the thought lingered, but more for raccoons and smaller scavengers. The rope stretched from one trunk to another, sagging with the weight of what we'd packed. Later that evening, before retreating to our tents, we decided to take them down. I can still feel the coarse nylon in my hands as I tugged the rope free, the smell of campfire clinging to my sleeves, the way the cold air seemed sharper once the bags were in the dirt. We laid them out, rummaged through, pulled what we needed, and stacked the rest. Nothing out of the ordinary. When we finally zipped ourselves inside the thin walls of our tents, the forest had already shifted. The fire had burned low, reduced to red bones of wood glowing faintly. The trees around us became towering silhouettes. Beyond them, the blackness was complete. No moon, no stars, just the invisible shape of endless branches above. Inside the tent, every sound was magnified. The crinkle of a sleeping bag, the sigh of nylon shifting with my breath. I lay there, waiting for sleep, but my body remained awake, nerves stretched tight. The night pressed down in waves. Every gust of wind sounded like whispers in the needles overhead. Every snapping twig carried too much weight, too much intent. At some point, I must have drifted off, though lightly, because the smallest noise pulled me back, an almost metallic clink, faint but deliberate. I thought it might have been the fire collapsing in on itself, though the rhythm was wrong. It sounded higher, above ground, as though something brushed against rope. I told myself not to think about it. Not every noise deserved attention. But once the thought planted itself, I couldn't shake it. I kept picturing our food bags, the empty line of rope hanging loose after we had taken them down. The sound repeated, softer this time, but unmistakable. A squeak, like taut fibers shifting under weight. My chest felt cold, my breath shallow. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there and listened. Morning came pale and thin. The air smelled of damp ash and pine resin, heavy with dew. The fire was cold, the ground still marked where we'd sat, the footprints frozen in dark soil. And then I saw it. Hanging above the clearing, between the same two trunks, our food bags dangled neatly in place. Each one tied off, hanging at the exact height we'd originally left them. For a moment, my mind refused to make sense of it. The rope sagged gently, swaying in a breath of wind that didn't touch the ground. The knots were tight. The bags were still full, bulging with food. We had taken them down. I remembered the weight of them, the way the straps dug into my fingers. I remembered how we had set them aside. But here they were, put back up, as though the night had reversed itself. It was the silence around them that unsettled me most. No rustle of movement, no evidence of struggle. Just the perfect return of something we had undone. The dirt beneath the trees looked undisturbed, though if I stared long enough, I thought I saw impressions, lighter patches among the pine needles, where something heavier than a raccoon might have stood. The others noticed too, but none of us spoke. It wasn't denial. It was the weight of realization pressing down on us, the quiet agreement that some things are better left unnamed. I scanned the forest edge again and again. The trees stood motionless, their bark slick with dew, their branches too still. And yet, it felt like eyes were on us. Eyes not attached to anything human, eyes that had never blinked. The bags creaked as they swayed. That sound stayed with me more than anything, the dull groan of rope under strain. It felt like a reminder, a quiet proof that someone or something had been among us while we slept. Not stealing, not destroying, just rearranging, returning. When we pulled them down again, the knots resisted in a way they hadn't before. Tight, deliberate, almost as if tied with practiced precision. The rope burned against my palms, the smell of raw fibers mixing with the damp air. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The rest of the trip passed in a haze. Food tasted different, flat and bitter. The forest no longer looked like trees, but like walls, holding something just out of sight. Every step felt monitored. The air was too still at times, then suddenly stirred with cold drafts that carried no source. At night, I lay awake, watching the faint outline of the tent's fabric, waiting for the sound of rope creaking again. It never came, not exactly. But sometimes, faintly, I would hear something soft brushing the ground. A dragging, a shift. Once, I swear I smelled smoke, though the fire had long gone out. Smoke mixed with something sweeter, almost like decay. We left earlier than planned. Packed in silence, moved quickly. The rope, still damp, coiled roughly as if reluctant to be put away. I didn't look back at the trees. I didn't want to see if the bags were still hanging after we carried them away. Even now, I think about that night. Not the fear exactly, but the suggestion behind it. Something in those woods didn't want our food. It wanted us to know it was there. It wanted us to feel its touch in small, impossible details. It didn't harm. It didn't take. It only returned things to where they belonged. Except nothing belonged in that place. Not us, not our food, not even the fire we left smoldering. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the sound of rope straining under a hidden weight, swaying gently, as if waiting for me to notice again. I had chosen that stretch of forest because it was supposed to be quiet, far from the highways, away from the echo of distant houses. It was the kind of silence that swallowed everything. I carried my tent, my sleeping bag, the food I had packed meticulously, and the old lantern I always trusted when the night pressed in. I wanted nothing more than to escape for a weekend, to be swallowed by the trees and forget the world I'd left behind. The forest was older than it looked on the maps. The trunks of the pines rose like enormous pillars, their bark cracked and bleeding with resin that smelled sharp in the air. The ground was soft with needles, muffling every step. Even before I had chosen my campsite, I noticed how the quiet wasn't just an absence of sound, but a kind of pressure. Birds called in the distance, but they sounded far away, as though reluctant to come closer. I set up camp near a slight clearing. The sun bled orange across the sky, spilling through the branches in fractured beams. My tent faced east, where the trees grew denser, a black curtain I knew I wouldn't dare to push through once darkness fell. The air cooled as the sun sank lower, and by the time I had boiled water and eaten, the world had grown hushed, the kind of stillness that forces you to listen harder. The fire I built was small. Flames licked at the wood with a dry, hungry crackle, and the smell of smoke mingled with pine sap and damp earth. I remember sitting there, wrapped in the warmth, watching the shadows lengthen and merge until the forest became one unbroken wall of blackness. The stars above shimmered between branches, but the forest floor remained untouched by their light. It was sometime after midnight when I first heard it. The sound was faint, carried on the shifting air, my name whispered. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, the crackle of firewood or the rush of air through branches shaping themselves into something familiar. But the syllables were unmistakable, drawn out low, as though spoken by someone whose mouth was only inches from my ear, yet echoing from the treeline. I froze. My skin prickled as though every hair on my body stood on end. The fire popped, throwing sparks, and in that brief light I searched the edge of the clearing. The forest looked unchanged, just blackness, layers upon layers of trees, their shapes blending into one another. The whisper came again. My name. Softer this time, but closer, like something was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. The air turned heavy. My breathing seemed too loud, and I found myself trying to stifle it, listening for the faintest sound over the thud of my heartbeat. There was no shuffle of leaves, no crack of branches. Just my name, drawn out and left to hang in the air before the silence swallowed it whole. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that solitude plays games on the mind, that exhaustion can trick the ears. Yet, even as I tried to rationalize it, I noticed something unsettling. My name hadn't been spoken in my head. It wasn't thought. It was sound. Real, vibrating sound carried through the air. The fire burned low. Shadows stretched further across the clearing, and I realized I had let the flames die too much. My hands shook as I threw on more wood, sparks leaping up into the night. I sat closer, the heat biting at my skin, as though I could use the light as a shield. But the forest had grown different. The night had weight now. I could smell the damp, the mold of leaves deep in the soil, the resin of the trees, but beneath it all was something faint, something metallic, like rust or blood. It lingered on the air, creeping into my nose with every shallow breath. The whisper came again. My name. From behind me. I spun, my lantern swinging, the shadows tearing open across the trunks. Nothing stood there. Only the same unbroken trees, their rough bark catching the weak light, their roots curling like veins in the soil. But the whisper had been clear, undeniable, closer than before. I didn't move for what felt like hours. My eyes strained at the tree-line, and my ears searched for any sign of movement. Yet the forest was absolute in its stillness. No insects droned, no night birds called. Even the wind seemed to have fled. When finally I retreated into my tent, it was not out of comfort, but out of a desperate need to shut something out. The fabric walls felt paper-thin, useless, but I zipped them closed, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to convince myself that I was safe. The lantern's glow filled the tent with a pale yellow haze, throwing my shadow long and distorted across the nylon. I lay there listening. Every rustle of fabric, every tiny shift of my weight sounded too loud. I tried to close my eyes, but the fear gnawed at me, refusing to let me drift. And then again the whisper. My name. This time it came from directly outside the tent. The sound wasn't muffled by trees or distance, it was right there. Inches away, as though someone crouched low, pressing their lips against the thin fabric. My name seeped through, dragged out in a tone that was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. Just breathy, wrong, stretched like something imitating the sound of a human voice. The walls of the tent shivered with the faint breeze of it. I stopped breathing. I waited, clutching the sleeping bag, so tightly the zipper cut into my palms. My ears rang in the silence that followed, and every nerve in my body screamed at me not to move, not to make a sound. There was no crackle of leaves, no snapping of twigs. Whoever, or whatever, stood there made no noise except that one word, my name, whispered again and again with impossible patience. Minutes or hours passed. I couldn't tell anymore. I only remember the way my body ached from remaining still, the way my throat burned with dryness, and the way that voice came and went like the tide, sometimes closer, sometimes retreating, but never gone. When exhaustion finally claimed me, it was not sleep that followed, but something heavier, like being dragged down into a pit. I woke to gray light bleeding through the tent. Morning. The forest outside was alive again, birds chattering, wind stirring through the branches, the ordinary sounds of the world I thought I had lost. For a moment, I believed I had dreamt it, that everything had been nothing but the twisting of an overtired mind. But when I unzipped the tent, the sight waiting for me froze the breath in my lungs. All around the clearing, pressed into the soft earth and pine needles, were marks. Not footprints, not human, just depressions, shallow but deliberate, circling the tent in a wide ring. Dozens of them, as though something had walked slowly, patiently, again and again through the night. The smell of metal still lingered faintly in the air. I packed in silence, each movement mechanical, frantic. I didn't bother eating. I didn't even look back once I started walking. I only knew I had to get out of that forest, to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever had spoken my name in the dark. But even now, long after, I can still hear it. At night, when the house settles, when the world quiets down, sometimes I swear I hear the faintest whisper. My name, and I wonder if it ever left the woods at all.